Welcome to Hughes Performance Tech Talk. I'm your host, Pete Nichols. Today we're continuing our Powerglide 101 series, and we're going to be covering the Planetary Gearset. If you've been following along, you know that we are basically breaking down the Powerglide transmission from front to rear to help you, our valued viewers, gain better understanding of what's going on inside a Powerglide. If this is your first time checking in with us, we hope that you enjoy the content, and if you do, we ask that you'd please consider subscribing. And make sure you hit that bell in the right-hand corner there of your screen so that you're getting notifications when our new content is uploaded weekly. So we'll get right into the subject. On Planetary gear sets for the Powerglide, there were two options from General Motors from the factory. There was a 1.82 to 1 ratio in low gear, and there was a 1.76 to 1 ratio in low gear. The parts that you see laid out on the table are all aftermarket components rather than being original GM, and that's going to be the focus of the episode because most of the Powerglides that we build today and that are popular in use feature all these aftermarket Planetary components rather than relying on the OEM gear sets. Although there still are quite a few OEM gear set builds being produced not only by Hughes Performance but by a variety of manufacturers out there. The reason that we focus on the aftermarket Planetary components is because the OEM gear sets are relatively weak compared to how much power today's engines are capable of generating. So your factory 182 gear set, you're typically going to want to limit your total power output right around the 450 to 500 flywheel horsepower range. And they can break at lower power levels than that. On the flip side, we've also had customers that have ran them at higher power levels than that, haven't had a failure. If you're going to use one of those gear sets, whether it be 182 or the stronger 176, you just need to keep in mind that you're dealing with 50 or 60-year-old Planetary components that have an unknown amount of duty cycling on them, unknown stressors, and it could be one of those things where it could be a grenade with a pin pulled, or it just never gives you a problem. The larger 176 carrier from GM definitely can handle more power than that. They used a larger gear than the 182 stuff. I don't have a 182 gear out here because they're honestly kind of a waste of time. But the 176 we generally like to limit around 650 flywheel horsepower or so. It's a little more forgiving on how much power you can effectively throw at it without breakage. We've had customers throw 800 or 900 horsepower at a stock 176 Planetary and never have an issue. But again, it's one of those things because you have unknown history on the components and unknown stress, heat, so on and so forth. Again, you could have a failure at a lower power level or very early on in using the transmission just out of the blue, totally unexpectedly. So that being said, enter the aftermarket with all of these stronger components. So we're going to spend a few minutes here just kind of naming the components to familiarize you with what's going on with Powerglide Planetaries. We did an episode on output shafts. You can definitely go back and check that out for more detail, but this is obviously the output shaft. You can see it has a flange on it, and this is the Planetary carrier housing. This is also referred to in the industry as a bowl, kind of a slang term for it, simply because it's bowl-shaped. And you can see how the output shaft indexes into that Planetary carrier. And there's two ways to attach this. You can either bolt it through the through holes, or you can actually run a bead of weld between the two components. Traditionally, as far as Hughes goes, we've always been a welded output shaft company, but we recently have switched our parts designs to take advantage of the bolt-together style carrier. This is something that's relatively new for us, late 2019 and of course this year. So as we move forward, we're going to be doing bolt-together carriers just to make it more serviceable and end-user friendly, since a lot of guys will buy a Powerglide and then later down the road they'll service it themselves. So that way, if you want to freshen up the carrier assembly with new thrust washers and you're a do-it-yourself enthusiast, whether you buy one of our Planetaries or a whole transmission, it enables you to do that easily. As far as output shafts go, there's different forging and forged steel and billet steel shafts out there. Our shafts are a forged steel, very strong. Again, go back and check out the output shaft episode if you want more information on that. As far as the carrier housing goes, it's cast iron construction, much like the OEM 176 carrier housing. Side note, the OEM 176 carrier housing is incredibly strong. The gears themselves are what's the weak link. So if you wanted to remove the OEM output shaft and flange and reuse your carrier housing, if you're a do-it-yourself builder, it's hard to say that there's a real horsepower limitation to the actual carrier housing itself. We ran well over 3,000 horsepower through a stock carrier housing with all the aftermarket components and never had any issue. So kind of a tip, you don't have to buy this aftermarket. The OEM piece, if you want to reuse it, is very good. Moving away from the shaft and the housing, you have all the small parts that are inside the Planetary that make up the whole assembly. So we'll just move through some of the parts here. You have pinion pins. That's what your pinion gears ride on. You have these little tiny roller needle bearings, and might be hard to see. We'll get a close-up of that so you can see it better. These needle bearings actually ride between your pinion pin and between your pinion gears, and then you have your pinion needle bearing spacers, and these actually slide over your pinion pins and establish correct spacing for the bearings so that you have bearings that aren't riding end to end against each other. And that would create metal and allow the bearings to cock inside the gear, and then your gear set binds up. So past that, you have your pinion thrust washers. There's a couple different styles here. We have the single tab design and we have the figure 8 design. These are based on OEM GM 176 offerings, and these are actually made new in the aftermarket by Sonics. And in an OEM style carrier or an aftermarket, you'll generally have 3 figure 8s and 6 single tab. There are some carrier and output shaft assemblies out there that will delete the figure 8 and use 12 single tab. And these ride on each side of your pinion gears. Your pinion gears ride inside your housing, so those thrust washers give you a nice wear surface between your steel components so that you don't have steel on steel. The thrust washers do wear, they wear slowly, they're very durable, so they don't need frequent maintenance or replacement. But if you do have a lot of runs on your gear set, it is a good idea to either send your gear set in, or if you have a bolt together carrier and you want to service it yourself, definitely look at replacing these thrust washers occasionally. That being said, for somebody that's doing a lot of drag racing, whether it be bracket car or heads up car or whatever, servicing the Planetary is really only necessary probably every 3 or 4 seasons. If you're racing a lot, if you want to do it more frequently, that's not an issue, just to stay ahead of the curve. But it's not something that's a super high maintenance item as far as replacing the thrust washers. We also have this bronze thrust washer, and this bronze thrust washer rides between the input gear and the output shaft. So you can see it's got a machined recess there. And again, we just have the thrust washers in there as sacrificial wear items, so you don't have steel on steel inside your Planetary gear set. Moving right through the parts selection here, we also have this little bushing. You'll find this bushing, it goes right inside the output shaft here, and this bushing actually helps the input shaft to pilot and locate to the output shaft in the transmission assembly. Again, very low wear item. Even in original Planetaries that have 100,000 plus miles on them, we'll find that this bushing looks like it's never been touched. So it's not a frequent replacement item, but it is readily available. Again, if you're servicing your own, obviously we put new bushings in every build. That item can be easily serviced. This is a retainer plate for your pins, and you can see the pins have a slot that the retainer plate engages. This is one of several styles of retaining the pin in the carrier and the output shaft. This is probably going to fight me, make me look stupid, but that's okay. It will. Anyway, the pin slides through the output shaft and through the carrier, and then this retaining ring sits like so on the outside of the output shaft and just sort of spins and locks those pins in place so they don't walk out on you. There's a variety of different design pins out there. Not all of them use this slot mechanism. Some are threaded on the end and they just use a retaining nut to hold it all together. Some are drilled and tapped and use a bolt that threads inside to retain it. There's no right or wrong. All three designs are valid. It kind of just boils down to builder personal preference. You also have two thrust bearings in the Planetary assembly. You have an input gear thrust bearing and you have an output shaft to case thrust bearing. So your input gear thrust bearing rides on the other side of the input gear, which is your splined gear. So you have your bronze thrust washer on one side, inside of your output shaft, and you have your input gear thrust bearing on the other side. And that little hat piece on the washer centers inside the sun gear and keeps everything true, and that controls your thrust and reduces friction. The roller bearing is an OEM design. They are available new from Sonics. If you're a do-it-yourselfer and your OEM bearing is in good shape, it doesn't feel gritty or notchy or anything like that, these are perfectly fine to reuse in your own build. And then the other thrust bearing we have is your output shaft to case. You can see this looks sort of unique. It's got a lip on the outside here, and the reason for that, there's a raised portion inside the transmission case that this lip helps locate the bearing to, so it doesn't slide around or move off center. And the output shaft has a corresponding lip on it as well, so that just helps locate the thrust bearing and keep it in place, and that's what rides between the output shaft and the inside of the rear of the case. Again, if you're a do-it-yourselfer and your original bearing's in good shape, there's nothing wrong with reusing it. These are very durable, they rarely wear out, but if you do need a new one, Sonics is your source on that as well. So moving into more of the meaty part of the Planetary, so to speak, are the gears themselves, and we have a few different examples here. OEM GM gears are all helical cut. That means that the teeth have an angle to them, or a bevel. Helical cut gears aren't quite as strong as straight cut gears, but they do run quiet, and for NVH requirements and passenger car use, that's why you'll see helical cut Planetary gears used from the OEMs. Straight cut gears, like what you see here, are significantly stronger than a helical cut. I'll hold those up so you can kind of see a side by side. The trade-off is they do make a little bit more noise. In most race cars, you'll never hear it, but with a straight cut gear, you can hear a howl in low gear. That's perfectly normal. If you're familiar with a gear drive or how a supercharger sounds, it's a similar tone, just not as noisy because it's housed inside the transmission case. In a street car, you're more prone to hear it than you are in a race car that's obviously going to have quite a bit louder exhaust system on it. But the trade-off in strength is well worth it. So all your high horsepower Powerglides, much over 1300 flywheel horsepower, if they don't have a straight cut gear in them, they should. We generally like to rate our billet helical cut, which you see here, at about 1250 at the flywheel. We've thrown more at it, but that's a good safe number. This is a gear we make in-house, and it is based on the original GM 176 gear. So if you hold them up side to side, they appear identical. It's just a much stronger 9310 steel, along with an 8-step heat treating and cooling process that we use. So Nice upgrade over stock 176. The straight cut stuff we have in 169 and 180 ratios. We also do the Sonics 158 and 165 ratios. And we offer a BTE 198 ratio, all in straight cut. There are other ratios available, both in helical and straight cut from a variety of manufacturers. ATI is a good source if you're looking for alternate ratios than what I just listed. They have quite a few different offerings, but we're going to stick to primarily what we offer here in this video. With the straight cut stuff, like the helical cut, we make it out of a 9310 billet steel. It goes through the same type of heat treating process. We'll also use the Sonics Extreme Duty gears, which have an additional REM finishing process to them. And that's a really killer Powerglide gear for extreme high horsepower, say like 2500-ish and higher at the flywheel. Our 169, which is pictured here, that we make in-house, we've actually been into the 3s and the 8th on this gear with no issues. So our own 169 is extremely durable, but we have options to cover basically anything you need in terms of ratio choice and strength level. The gears themselves, you have pinion gears, short and long, 3 of each. That's true of any Powerglide Planet. We already mentioned the input gear earlier, and you can see that's splined to slide on and off the input shaft. So that's the component that your input shaft is driving, the input gear inside the Planet. Then you have the sun gear. This is also sometimes referred to as a flange gear because the sun gear presses into the direct drum flange, or more appropriately called the pressure plate for the clutch pack. Go back and check out the drum episode if you're curious to learn more about that, because we cover that in detail. So basically what you have going on with these gears is you have your sun gear on the drum, you have your input shaft that passes through, you have your wetting band, which we cover in the drum episode, that helps locate that. And then you have your input gear riding inside, and you have your pinion gears rotating around the sun gear and the input gear. And what's going on when the input shaft is turning and you're in low gear, you have your band clamped around the drum. Again, check out the band episode that we have. That's holding your sun gear still. So you have your pinion gears rotating around the sun gear from the drive that's created by this splined gear on the input shaft. That in turn makes the output shaft spin and creates your ratio in low gear. When you make the gear change, the band releases off the drum, the direct clutches apply and allow this whole assembly to spin together. So basically when high gear comes on, you're creating high gear essentially by putting the gear train in a bind, because the drum is trying to turn the sun gear, the input shaft is trying to turn the input gear, and neither one of them can turn independently of each other in that scenario. So you're actually just driving the input shaft and output shaft at a 1-to-1 ratio by locking the gear set together in high gear. So a pretty simple operation as far as that goes in the Powerglide. And because you're creating that binding action in the gear set, that's where all your stressors come from in terms of the amount of horsepower and torque that you're applying to the transmission. And that's why you need a really good high quality gear set when you're generating a lot of horsepower, so it can handle that stress that's created in high gear. A lot of planetary failures don't come as a result of failure in low gear. It comes as a result of a failure in high gear because of that bind that's created in the gear set to create the 1-to-1 ratio between your input and output shafts. So contrary to popular belief, you won't usually see a lot of planetary failures at the starting line in a drag racing scenario. You'll more see them down track because of that bind on the gear change. That's where the shock to the gear set really happens. This kind of gives you a nice visual of a partially assembled Planetary. This is actually a 158 ratio unit from Sonex. Very killer piece. And your sun gear comes up through the middle here. Your input gear would ride down in here. And then of course you have your output shaft and flange over here. And you can just kind of see the orientation of the components with the pins and your single tab thrust washers, and your figure 8 thrust washers are going to be down in this area between these two gears. And then of course you have your needle bearings riding in here along with your spacers that we talked about earlier. And then this component is the last piece of the puzzle to the Planetary. This is your ring gear. Some guys call it a reverse ring gear because the reverse clutches actually spline to the ring gear. And this rides around the outside of the Planetary. And that's going to make me look dumb too. And that's okay. There we go. So we'll hold that up so you can kind of see the spinning action here. What's going on in the gear set. So your reverse clutches spline around the ring gear and help create reverse ratio when the clutch pack applies. And we have a clutch pack laid out here for you to see. So we've got pressure plates, a couple different thicknesses depending on how you're stacking your clutch. We have the actual friction plate and we have the steel plate. And these very simply just drop on. The steels, you can see have these teeth sticking out. These locate to lugs inside your transmission case. And it just stacks up, so on and so forth. And once the clutch pack is built, you have your reverse piston riding inside the case. That moves from hydraulic pressure back and forth in the case and actually applies the clutch pack, squeezes it to lock the ring gear in place and create reverse ratio. And of course the piston has inner and outer lip seals to provide sealing for that hydraulic circuit, so the piston will obviously move. Spring pockets here for return springs. Stamped steel retainer goes over it. If you watch the direct drum episode, the direct drum has a similar setup. You can get a better visual of what's going on there. And that's pretty much it. That's what's going on in a Powerglide Planetary. There's also a lot of cool other parts from Sonex. They have ring gear stabilizers. They have different types of thrust control systems going on. So we use a lot of that in our builds. Very cool stuff. Definitely get on their website and check it out. You can see all of their Powerglide transmission parts listings. We have a lot of this stuff that we make in-house as well, so we're happy to help you out that way. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you have any questions, definitely drop us a line in the comments below. We'll be happy to interact with you. You can reach us at 1-800-274-RACE. That's RACE. You can also find us online at hughesperformance.com, and we have new content going up daily on our Facebook and Instagram pages, so check us out there. We appreciate you tuning in, and we look forward to talking with you next time.